Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to the third day of the APS Hybrid Conference, Meanings of Independence. I'm glad that so many of you have been able to join us today. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. The Society expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of the Lenape, as well as that of numerous other Indigenous communities and individuals throughout the continent who have offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration that make the work of the Society's Library and Museum possible. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over 1.5 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please come visit our website, amphilsoc.org. We'll put that address in the chat box to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. As part of the programming for the David Center for the American Revolution, this week's conference on Meanings of Independence brings together public intellectuals, scholars, educators, leaders of cultural organizations and government agencies, and other engaged citizens who have an interest in the revolution and its commemoration in 2026. Now, today is the third and final virtual panel, and tomorrow, Thursday, October 21st, we gather in person for a project showcase for the Revolutionary City, a portal to the nation's founding at 4 p.m., and an opening keynote conversation featuring Scott Stevenson, Anthea Hardig, and Christy Coleman at 6 p.m. The conference will continue in person on Friday, October 22nd, with a full day of discussion and reflection on the meanings of independence. A full schedule is available on the conference website. And while we will be meeting in person, all the sessions will also be live streamed and accessible via the APS website and Facebook page. So if you're out there and you can't make it to Philadelphia, please zoom in. We are using Zoom webinar today, so not to worry, you've all been muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom center of your navigation bar. You might want to locate that right now. You can type your question in at any time. There'll be time at the end of the panel for questions with our speakers. We're also very happy to offer closed captioning for today's discussion. If you'd like to use it during the panel, please click on the CC box, again on that bottom navigation bar of Zoom. It is to the right of the Q&A button. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce Jack Rakove, who will be moderating today's panel on contesting power and authority in the age of revolutions. Dr. Rakove is the William Robertson Coe Professor of History and Professor of Political Science Emeritus at Stanford University, where he taught from 1980 to 2020. A Chicago native, he earned his AB in History from Haverford College in 1968, studied at the University of Edinburgh, and completed his doctorate at Harvard in 1975, where he studied with Bernard Bailyn. He's the author of 8 books, including The Beginnings of National Politics, An Interpretive History of the Continental Congress, published in 1979, Original Meanings, Politics and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution, 1996, which won the Pulitzer Prize in History, the Francis Tavern Museum Book Prize, and the Society of Cincinnati Book Prize, and Revolutionaries, A New History of the Invention of America, 2010, which was a finalist for the George Washington Prize. He's the editor of another 7 books and has written scores of op-eds for such newspapers as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle. His media appearances include Whose Curse is Worse?, The Red Sox and Cubs on Trial from 2004, and an Emmy Award-winning episode of The Daily Show from 2010. His next book is The Ticklish Experiment, A Political History of the Constitution. And we are so happy he could join us today. So let me bring him up on the screen. And I will hand things over.
Well, I think I'm here, although I'm not seeing myself.
You are here. Go ahead.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Kyle. It's a real pleasure to be able to chair the third of these panels this week. I'm going to briefly introduce our 3 authors. And then we'll, once they're done with the presentations, we'll have a bit of a round robin conversation and then open things up for further discussion. So our three speakers today, the first will be John Nelson, who is the assistant professor of early American history at Texas Tech University. John finished his PhD at the University of Notre Dame in 2020. His research examined the ways that ecology and geography have shaped the terms of cross-cultural interaction between native peoples and European colonizers from the 17th century through the early Republican period. His current book project, which is tentatively titled 5 Miles of Muddy Ground, examines the shifting power dynamics between Anishinaabe, French, British, and American settlers at the strategically important Chicago portage. His most recent article has just appeared in the William Mary Quarterly, which some of you no doubt received by now, Siginox War of Independence. And that's actually the basis of the talk he's going to give this afternoon. Our second speaker will be Susan Brinwon. She's a doctoral student of early American history in the American Civilization program at the University of Delaware. She just told us that she passed her general oral exams yesterday, so she's to be congratulated by everyone listening to this broadcast. Brynne has published articles for the Journal of the American Revolution, as well as the Washington Post. She specializes in issues involving prisoners of war and local governance during the American Revolution. Her broader interests in colonial America include the 17th century Atlantic world, frontiers, performative loyalty in wartime, and the intergenerational traumas of warfare. Our third speaker, much closer in age to myself, is Ned Lansman, who recently retired from the Department of History at Stony Brook University, where he taught for 41 years. Ned received his PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania in 1979, where he studied under Richard Dunn. He turned his dissertation into a first book, Scotland and Its First American Colony, published in 1985, and he followed that book with From Colonials to Provincials, American Thought and Culture, 1680 to 1720, and Crossroads of Empire, the Middle Colonies, as well as writing a number of articles, book chapters, and edited collections. Ned has held fellowships and grants from, among other sources, the American Philosophical Society, the ACLS, the National Endowment of the Humanities. His primary research fields are early American history and early modern Scotland, with emphasis on religion, ethnicity, migration, and the Enlightenment. And I'll just add that having spent a year at the University of Edinburgh, it's always a particular treat for me to hear Ned speak. So without further ado, John, we're going to turn the microphone or whatever device we're using over to you, and we'll take it from there.
Great. Thanks, Jack. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and many thanks to the APS for putting this on and inviting us all to join virtually and then gather us in person in the upcoming days. I'm looking forward to being a part of all of this. As Jack mentioned, this talk and this paper that I shared with you today do draw on a current publication that is coming out with the William and Mary Quarterly in the October issue. So if it hasn't shown up in your mailbox or your desk, it soon will in a more elaborated form than what I'm going to give you today. But basically, it is a look at an indigenous headman, an Anishinaabe leader known as Sigenauk, and I'm going to talk a little bit about his name in a minute, but he rose to power during the Revolutionary era in the Western Great Lakes, and I've got a map thrown up here for everyone to view, because it's not necessarily the most familiar theater, I will say, of the American Revolution. So this is maybe a helpful visualization of where we're actually talking about here. Basically, the Western Great Lakes and Illinois country during the formative years of the Revolutionary period. I did not start this project by looking for Sigenauk, I will say. This comes out of research that I've been doing for my current book project, looking at the varying power dynamics of the Chicago portage from the French contact period into the early Republic. But this figure, Sigenauk, continued to pop up in the records beginning in the 1770s and spanning into the 1790s. And so digging deeper into his story, I think, offers us a pretty powerful caveat to some of the declension narratives we tell about Native peoples and their fate in the American Revolution. So that's kind of my pitch about why this matters in this far-flung kind of peripheral region during the American Revolution. First of all, Blackbird or Sigenauk was very hard to find in the archives, although he does pop up in Spanish sources, American sources, and British sources at this time. It took some effort to actually piece together that this was the same guy. Earlier histories know of Blackbird or Sigenauk, but they usually conflate him with his son, who is a prominent headman at Chicago during the War of 1812. And so actually figuring out that this is a separate guy who goes by a kind of a multiplicity of names during the Revolutionary era was really the first step towards uncovering this story of his actions during the American Revolution. So he's known simultaneously as Blackbird among the Americans, Sigenauk among the British, Les Tourneaux among French speakers in the Great Lakes, and El Haturno by the Spanish commandant at St. Louis. This seems to be drawn from an Anishinaabe word Sigenauk, which signifies the red-winged blackbird that is endemic to the region. So actually piecing together that this was the same person across archival records was important to this story. And what Sigenauk seems to be doing during the American Revolution is actually building his reputation as a headman from the ground up. So it gives us an idea and a way to see how an individual indigenous person becomes a leader in Anishinaabe society, but also it shows us this upward trajectory that he leads his people on, the southwestern faction of the Anishinaabe west of Lake Michigan during the Revolutionary War. And that's what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about today. Because Sigenauk's actions and goals are actually pretty fascinating when we start to think about native approaches to harnessing the conflict to their own purposes. He was interested in promoting himself and his personal authority among the Anishinaabe people, but he's also interested in kind of establishing and carving out a piece of Anishinaabe-Waukee, the homeland of the Anishinaabe, west of Lake Michigan. The towns that he represents west of the lake, including Chicago and Petit Fort, and these other settlements along the Illinois River, were fairly new settlements by the 1770s. They had been established by the Anishinaabe in the 1740s and 50s. And so they don't have the long-term headman structure that we see east of the lake in places like L'Arbre Croche, the Grand River, and the St. Joseph River Valley. And so Sigenauk's really kind of building from the ground up in this new space. And he's claiming power through a combination of traditional Anishinaabe expectations as an Ogema, or a civil leader of Anishinaabe society, but also kind of embracing revolutionary new opportunities in the borderlands. These look a little bit different than we might expect. So first of all, Sigenauk embraces an alliance with the Spanish in St. Louis in the early years of the war before Spain actually joins the conflict. He then goes on to forge ties with George Rogers Clark when the Virginia militia enters the Illinois country in 1778-79. And he establishes a relationship with Clark that allows him to draw on trade goods from the Americans and also continue this correspondence through a series of letters between the western villages of Anishinaabe and the American patriots in the Illinois country. He goes on to challenge British authority in the Great Lakes and even challenge British military campaigns against St. Louis when they move against Spanish St. Louis later in the war. And he's going to culminate his actions during the Revolutionary War with this risky raid into the St. Joseph River Valley, which puts him at odds with not just the British that are controlling the dilapidated fort there, but also some of his own Anishinaabe kin east of the lake. That being said, he never goes to war against his own Anishinaabe people, right? He doesn't violently oppose the British allied faction of Anishinaabe. He rather kind of bluffs his way through this encounter at the St. Joseph in 1780-81 and establishes his own authority as an Anishinaabe leader, not to be messed with west of the lake, but also his people's factional authority in that new territory and in their new villages in Chicago and the Illinois country. So why does this matter? Well, I think it shows us a couple things. First of all, from a kind of a geopolitical standpoint, Sigenauk's raid to the St. Joseph actually catches the attention of Benjamin Franklin, the King of Spain, John Jay, and other figures in this wider Atlantic world. It scares them, right? Because he leads a basically Spanish militia expedition against British territory in the Great Lakes. And the Americans are worried that the Spanish can claim the Great Lakes by right of conquest after the war. So it has geopolitical stakes to it. But more importantly, it shows us that some Native people are actually able to harness this conflict on their own turf, in their own terms, and use it to promote their agendas, not just as individuals, but also as factions within people groups. So the Southwestern Anishinaabe, these late migrants west of the lake, use the conflict to establish their own diplomatic autonomy with the Spanish and Americans, to kind of eschew relations east of the lake with the British and other Eastern Anishinaabe, and yet never actually break down into kind of an intertribal conflict with their own people group. At the end of the war, this sets Sigenauk up to be a prominent headman going forward into the 1790s, and it sets his son up to be the important headman when it comes time for the War of 1812 in the Chicago region. With that, I'm going to wrap up now. I realize I talked quickly, but I'm happy to kind of have this conversation throughout the Q&A. Thank you for your time.
All right, I guess that's me. So thank you so much, Professor Nelson, for that excellent talk. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, so thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate your participation in this panel today. I'm going to be presenting my paper, The Disagreeable Situation in Between the Civil and the Military, American Prisoner of War Management During the American Revolution. During the course of the American Revolution, between 18,000 and 20,000 prisoners were captured by the Patriot forces. And these men, when they couldn't be exchanged for one reason or another, were generally hosted in small towns across the colonies. And the thought process behind this on the part of General George Washington and the Congress was that it was better to not let prisoners escape back to the British forces. So Congress directed for prisoners instead to be kept in small isolated communities throughout the colonies, which were distant from areas which might better facilitate escapes. So for example, port towns are going to be out, big cities are going to be out, and then areas which are just proximate to the warfare are going to be out. And I argue that by looking at these inland communities which hosted prisoners of war during the American Revolution, we can better understand how ordinary Americans experienced the political changes of their generation, moving from colonial governing traditions to new federal systems. So if you read my pre-circulated paper, and if you're here at this panel today, I hope that you'll come away with 3 takeaways. The first is that Americans experienced the new federal system through its arms branch, that would be the Continental Army. The second is before the militarization of military processes and functions, state and local governments aided in prisoner of war management. And the third is civilian involvement in the management of prisoners created tensions with the Continental Army. So as I mentioned before, prisoners are held in all of the colonies during the American Revolution. The 3 colonies that I focus on in my paper, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, are not the only 3, but so far my research has focused on the mid-Atlantic colonies as well as New England. So that's why the focus is there. Wherever you have the British gaining prisoners, you're going to have prisoners either moving through a colony or being held in that colony. So this is certainly something, with 18 to 20,000 prisoners that affects a huge swath of the early American population during the Revolution. Now, these prisoners frequently would arrive with little to no instruction and little to no forewarning. What you're seeing here on your screen in the bottom corner is a selection from a resolution that the Congress passes in 1776 about the care and keeping of prisoners. And what this selection says is that whether a prisoner is captured on the sea or is captured on land, they're going to be conveyed to a colony and then will be subject to the supreme executive authority of that colony. And this is worth noting because, of course, I think a lot of us here know, during the American Revolution, you have different forms of supreme executive authorities emerging. So across the colonies, prisoners are being subject to the authority of assemblies, to the authority of councils of safety, to committees, to conventions, et cetera, et cetera. Another important part of this resolution comes a little bit later, and it authorizes the states to, quote, superintend the authority of the prisoners that they have been entrusted with. And this proves to be the most important of Congress's directions to the states, because while they do offer some more specifics about how to take care of prisoners of war, for example, noting the differences in treatment standards for officers and enlisted men, these instructions are very far and few between, and oftentimes states and local authorities have to use discretionary measures on the ground when it comes to taking care of prisoners. So what did the command structure actually look like when it came to taking care of prisoners during the American Revolution? I've laid out this diagram, which I'm realizing is kind of confusing looking, but basically George Washington in 1776 urges the Congress to create a post for a commissary general of prisoners. And this role is initially filled by Elias Boudinot. He fills it for a year, and then he is succeeded by two further commissary generals throughout the rest of the conflict. And then the Congress says that the states themselves need to appoint deputies to serve under the commissary general. These deputies, in the beginning of the war, there's only two, but by the end of the war, there's so many prisoners that there's at least one deputy per state. So this is a selected list here based on my research to this point. These men, it's important to note, typically were chosen by the state out of local and state governments. So for example, Ezekiel Williams there, he was the second state deputy of prisoners for Connecticut. He served as a sheriff in Wethersfield, Connecticut before he assumed this role. He also was in the Committee of Correspondence for that town. So it's very common for these men to have already served in governing positions. And then when they are appointed as state deputies, they do receive the rank of major in the Continental Army. One more step below, we have local authorities, and that's the state deputies are working with these men to take charge of the prisoners and to arrange for their housing, to arrange for their provisioning, and to arrange for their care in the event that they get sick. So local authorities could include militiamen and officers, they could include sheriffs, jail keepers, and then one further step down, we have contracted private citizens who, as I said, would be fulfilling some of those needs in terms of provisioning and housing the prisoners. So for example, you can have private citizens being contracted to do construction work or being contracted to work as nurses when prisoners get ill and things like this. So prisoner of war management during the Revolution, I argue, was a very democratized process. You have people involved at all levels. So we have private citizens working in contract positions, but private citizens are also involved in the actual treatment and policy making surrounding prisoner of war management at the state and local level. And I talk about a couple of examples of this in the paper. One is relates to exchanges. So for example, in towns which hosted prisoners of war, if local men were captured by the British and word of that capture got back to that person's town, it's very common, and I've seen this time and time again in the records, for locals to actually petition either a town meeting or directly petition their state authorities to facilitate the exchange of that person using the British prisoners in their town. So we don't want these guys, we want our local guys back. And this is one way that ordinary American civilians are able to participate in the process of prisoner of war management. And they're also able to influence how prisoners are treated. So another example that I talk about in the paper is with Major Christopher French. He is an imprisoned British officer who is staying in Hartford, Connecticut. He takes a parole out of town one day, which he is allowed to do. He has a set period of time for which he's allowed to be gone and a perimeter in which he is allowed to travel freely. But he's kind of a thorn in the side of Hartford residents, and they petition and they rise up against their Committee of Correspondence and direct them to go and retrieve Major French and bring him back. So that's an example of where we see citizens reining in the prisoners who are in their town and controlling sort of where they're able to travel and where they're not able to travel. But this democratic involvement I've noticed so far too definitely leads to complications and tensions with the continental officials who are also stationed in their towns. So I have two examples on the screen here. These are both from Massachusetts. In one, Captain John Gooch, who served as the quartermaster of the Rutland Barracks, is complaining to General William Heath that despite Heath's rule that prisoners are not allowed to work, people keep breaking the prisoners out of their barracks, and there's nothing he can do about it. And he says, I'm hoping this will shed in a proper light the disagreeable situation in between the civil and the military. In a similar way, Jocelyn Mercereau, who is the Deputy Commissary General of Prisoners for the New England states, complains that he has been wrongfully accused through petitions to the Massachusetts General Court of letting prisoners go at large. And he takes this ad out in the Massachusetts Spy to defend himself and essentially to offset the blame onto other Rutlanders rather than onto himself. So I'll wrap up here before I go on too long, but I just wanted to sort of conclude by saying this is early stages of this research project, but so far I've discerned by looking at the Mid-Atlantic states and at New England states that prisoner of war management was a very democratic process that involved ordinary citizens, civilians, as well as military personnel. And I'm getting the sense, at least in this regional focus, that this democratic involvement definitely led to tensions with the Continental Army. I'm interested in exploring those tensions further and seeing whether or not they play out in other geographic contexts. I welcome your feedback and your questions on this work, and thank you again for attending today.
Hello, all. Are we there? I'm going to assume we are.
Yep, you're there.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And I want to thank the APS and the other panelists here and the organizers of the conference and all of you out there in Zoom land for having come and attended this conference and my paper in particular. This paper is part of a larger project in which I've been involved on and off for some time. Some of you out there know this. On the Anglo-Scottish Union of 1707, the Union of Parliaments, and its significance for the North American colonies. What difference did it make that those colonies went from being dependencies of a centralizing English state to provincial sectors of a multinational empire? And this paper extends that query to the particular effects of union on such things as taxation and governance. Among the Americans who forcefully rejected Britain's attempts to tax the colonies, James Otis stands out for his early and articulate objections. To Otis, like others, taxes were a gift to the people given by them or their elected representatives. Unlike some others, Otis insisted that Americans could and should be represented. Yet even for Otis, representation by itself would not preclude arbitrary taxation. Americans were full British subjects entitled to the rights and privileges of Britain, and the spirit of the British Constitution, he contended, must make an exception of all taxes until it is thought fit to unite a dominion to the realm. In short, no taxation without incorporation. What then was incorporation? I refer, of course, to the descriptive term applied to the Union of Parliaments, an incorporating union. It meant uniting the two into a comprehensive whole under a common governing authority. Incorporation generally was more substantial than simple representation. Scottish negotiators had unsuccessfully sought a less centralized and less taxing confederal union, but they did not succeed. Still, incorporation was not annexation, and if Scotland's foremost aim was to protect itself from arbitrary authority and arbitrary taxation in a union dominated by their larger neighbors, the union in practice would demonstrate that incorporation under the right conditions could do just that. And in that aspiration, the union provides a useful context for considering the later American crisis. The Union Treaty itself was composed more than anything else of a succession of limitations, of taxes and regulations that could not be imposed on Scotland, even by Parliament. While union in the end did lead to higher taxes in Scotland, compared to their English neighbors, Scotland remained significantly undertaxed. And you can see some of this in the paper that the hard copy paper that was presented. In addition, Scotland would, in addition, employ a series of small nation practices that they had long utilized in their own affairs, given the high rates of mobility and their use of trade diasporas previously. But these were all designed to protect weaker partners from the stronger, and maintain considerable autonomy at the community level. Alec Murdoch has referred to 18th century Scotland under the Union as semi-independent, which seems to me a concept worth thinking about. In Scotland, it signified the ability to preserve a measure of autonomy in the things that mattered, articulated in a treaty and acts of parliaments that represented something like a constitution for Great Britain, and in keeping with Scottish legal and covenanting traditions, was maintained in a text. For Americans such as Otis, semi-independence was more likely to reflect customary claims of loyalty more fully to the crown than to Parliament, especially in taxing authority. Those Scottish practices were in fact noticed by English and American observers, initiating a well-known period of Scotophobia led by John Wilkes and directed in particular at the government of the Prime Minister Lord Bute, a Scot. Ironically, it was the very practices designed to protect Scottish autonomy from an overbearing central authority that Americans came to resent, directed at Scottish merchants in the Chesapeake and colonial cities, and at the growing phalanx of Scottish officials everywhere. The prospect of incorporation in North America was frequently voiced, but never received much traction in the Anglo-American debate. Incorporation was a double-edged sword, in theory supporting mutuality and an exchange of rights, but also respecting sovereignty and authority. Otis, while advocating representation and uniting to the realm, specified that only a particular kind of union would be acceptable. It was one with what he called an American representation, a thorough beneficial union of these colonies to the realm, so that all the parts of the empire may be consolidated, with every real advantage to the subject abroad as well as at home. He contrasted that with a Welsh or Scotch representation, men partial to their own country, leading to the return of a half score of ignorant, worthless persons who, like some colony agents, might be induced to sell their country and their God for a golden calf. If the Union example suggests that incorporation could, in the right situation, protect provincial liberties, there were important things in the way of adapting the settlement of 1707. Those included the fact of ongoing warfare in 1707, but not in 1765, which had made England anxious for union to prevent problems on their northern border, Jacobite or otherwise. They included also the privilege of Scotland as a sovereign nation to negotiate terms of union in a diplomatic convention rather than as an imperial appeal, and the greater respect that would be paid to terms of union directed by Parliament and by treaty. The differences included as well the vastly greater wealth and power that the metropolis expected to be able to extract from the colonies, as opposed to the rather meager returns they had anticipated from Scottish taxation. There was simply less in Scotland to raise a ruckus over. And I'll say that at the risk of any of my Scottish friends who might be in the audience, but one of the great advantages of Scottish history has been the fact that there most often wasn't a whole lot that other people wanted to get from them. It is difficult to see in that a path towards a well-constructed semi-independence, either that Britons might have entertained or Americans tolerated. In what constitutional form could rather stringent limitations comparable to those negotiated in the Union Treaty have been implemented a half century later in North America. Full incorporation would have meant collapsing the empire into parliament and the realm. The rather idealistic American representation that Otis imagined was far removed from the workings of representation among Scots or in Parliament in general. As much as anything, the differences lay in the extent to which a common identity of all those incorporate into the realm could be imagined. The concept of incorporation supported a good deal of speculation as to what actual outcomes would be. Full incorporation in theory implied both equality and reversibility. There was, of course, Adam Smith's radical but far from unique proposal for an incorporation in which the continuing growth of the colonies would lead eventually to Parliament and the seat of government moved across the Atlantic. That became in time something of a commonplace, especially among Scottish observers. Or there was John Adams' Flight of Fancy in Novangus, where he envisioned a future dominant America that would come to rule over the British people and make the British people look for a way to resist. Or there was Benjamin Franklin's famous quip that at the time of the Union, Scots were afraid of being swallowed up by a stronger power. But instead, what had happened instead was that Scottish power in the Union had grown, particularly under Lord Bute's administration and his appointment of his Scottish imperial officials. So instead of, as Franklin put it, instead of instead of Scotland being swallowed up by the whale in the place of Jonah, as Franklin anticipated, it was Jonah in this case who swallowed the whale. Thank you.
We're just looking to see what happened to Jack. So hold on one second. Well, I will come on. We haven't had that glitch before in our Zoom land. So while we're waiting for Jack to come back on, and Maggie, if I could ask you behind the scenes just to keep an eye out, make sure that he didn't accidentally get switched to an attendee. Well, we have a ton of questions here that have come in from our audience, and I very much encourage everyone out there in Zoom land to ask your questions. We have a good, 25 minutes for questions here. And I know Jack wanted to give some overarching questions for you, but maybe I'll just jump right in if that sounds good to everyone. So I'm gonna go, we have a question here for John. This comes from Dan Richter, who's watching in Zoom land. And Dan writes, "Thank you so much for this wonderful paper and for your amazing detective work." And I think I very much agree with Dan that sounds like there was a lot of work that went into this. He'd like to ask you from a position of complete support to situate Sigenauk's story a little more clear historiographically. On one chronological end of your story is the historiographical pushback against Richard White's world made of fragments model, epitomized by Heidi Barnecker, Michael Wittgen, and Michael McDonnell, who stressed the enduring, if shape-shifting patterns of 18th century. Oh, and Jack is back.
Yeah, am I on? Sorry.
You are on. I'm sorry for that Zoom glitch. So I had started to ask John a question from the Q&A, but I'm going to turn it over to you, Jack, if you want to give your comments, and we'll come back to Dan's question.
Okay.
So
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened here. I'm at Stanford, Washington, and periodically I get kicked out of the Stanford system arbitrarily and have to talk about arbitrary power. I have to log myself back in. So I guess I missed a minute or two there, for which I apologize. So let me start quickly by making one general comment about the panel as a whole, and then I do have a set of questions I'll put to each of our speakers. So it seems to me in a kind of curious but striking way, this panel illustrates what I've thought of for a long time now was representing the overall architecture or matrix for how we should think broadly about the history of the revolution, perhaps looking ahead to 2026 or dealing with our current woes. First, it seems to me we do remain concerned with questions of causation, by which I mean, why did the revolution happen and what were its consequences? And that remains, I think, essentially a political story. And so in this case, I think Ned's paper, because it goes into some of the classical constitutional political questions, is an apt illustration and continuation of that theme. The second concern we have is with questions of experience, wholly independent of whether or not an individual or a community or some other group had an active or passive role in becoming the revolution. Everyone was caught up in it. In one way or another, either having to participate in it or being forced to participate in it or whatever. There seems to be Brynne's paper aptly illustrates that. I mean, communities across the country, somewhat randomly, wind up being venues where prisoners are installed and they have to be minded and so on. And necessarily they get sucked into this experience. What did the revolution mean literally on the ground? And I think the third dimension of modern states of revolution is really their geographic, or one could say hemispheric amplitude. That's to say, it's no longer a story of the seaboard versus the empire, what's going on in the big port towns or what's going on just on the battlefield. It's also very much a question of what's going on in the interior. How does it affect native peoples? What's going on hemispherically? What's going on globally, all the way to India, Gibraltar, and so on. And in its own distinctive way, it seems to be John's paper aptly illustrates that. Of course, I've also attached to John's paper because I am a native Chicagoan, native Cook County Democrat, native Chicago Cubs fan. And also, John, we used to vacation at Union Pier in Michigan, which is when I was a little boy back in the 50s, back during the McCarthy era, the original McCarthy era. Okay, so without further ado, John, I want to start with you, and I think I'm going to offer a short version of a rather more elaborate question that Dan Richter has already posted, and maybe you've glanced at this and seen it already. So it seems to me, as I read your paper and listen to your remarks, I find myself wondering about what is the nature of the Anishinaabe, I'm going to mangle the pronunciation, Anishinaabe community that we're talking about. I mean, when I think about these issues, because I've been a colleague of Richard White, and we've occupied adjoining offices the last 25 years. We went emeritus at the same time. But I always think of this within the framework of Richard White's middle ground. And of course, now you're writing about the nature of community when it's coming under additional duress in wartime. So I did find myself wondering, how does your work or your project relate to that conception of community? And I guess, since I have to do a bit of catch up here, let me put my second question out as well. How easy is it for you to distinguish strategic behavior, meaning the pursuit of long-term goals, from the kind of opportunistic or just the circumstantially necessary conditions that wartime, with its wholesale unpredictability, naturally generates? So, a kind of question about how do you think about community, its relationship to Revolutionary War in this case, and also about the since you are focused on Sigenauk and his own particular vision. Is he a grand strategist? Is he responding, as one often has to do, to events as they unfold, on that kind of basis?
That's a great question, Jack. And I think it'll actually help me to answer a little bit of Dan's question as well, right, in the same vein. So this question about Anishinaabe community politics, right? Richard White's got this great line about the American Revolution in the middle ground, where he says, you know, everyone loaded their village interests onto revolutionary wagons and rode them as far as they could. And so to answer the question about, is this just the middle ground? I think it's actually inverted, right? So in that formulation, there are these larger causes at play, the revolution, or let's say the imperial agenda of Spain or Britain, and middle ground peoples are along for the ride. Here, it's actually Sigenauk that is calling the shots, right? He's forcing the Spanish hand to go up against the British at St. Joseph. And he's not doing it because he cares about the British or the Spanish. He's doing it because he cares about his own power dynamics within Anishinaabe society. So I think in that way, it's a little bit inverted middle ground, right? Where the tail is very much wagging the dog in this instance. To get back to the kind of the opportunism versus the strategy here, Siginox exceptional in a way because it isn't just opportunistic, I don't think. A lot of early scholarship in the early 20th century looked at the Spanish raid as kind of a fetish and a fascination that the Spanish, actually march north and capture a British fort during the war. And they always pose it as opportunism. Maybe Sigenauk had a role in it, but he's just after plunder, or he's after pillaging. I think it's more than that because of these internal dimensions that we can start to see uncovered. So he happens to be married to the daughter of a St. Joseph Potawatomi, the people that he raids against, right? But doesn't lift the hatchet against, as he puts it. So I think there's internal rivalry dynamics there. And it also comes out of this Southwestern factionalism. And that's where I see kind of the work of Heidi Boecker and some of these other, Michael McDonald, Michael Witgen, because factionalism for the Anishinaabe is a usable strategy. So while the Eastern Anishinaabe are happy to play on alliances with the British, the Western ones are kind of free and clear to make their own diplomatic moves towards the Spanish or the Americans. And I think that kind of political flexibility, factionalism is a positive thing within Anishinaabe society, gives Sigenauk the kind of wiggle room he needs to make his move during the revolution. I don't know if that answers every element of those questions. Yeah.
Let me ask one follow-up question, which actually is opposite of having Dan, in on this conversation. When I taught Dan's book, both undergraduates and the graduate students, I find myself asking the question, over time, who were the Iroquois, broadly defined? I mean, if you take the emphasis on this ongoing process of, the whole concept of the captive war or whatever, having to incorporate people from other language groups, other tribes, other people within the Iroquois structure, I found myself wondering, as a kind of matter of almost of ethnic history, or in demographic terms, how much continuity in terms of the membership within any particular indigenous group, or to use Woody's language, we'll borrow the Canadian term, First Nation. But I think that in some ways it only begs the question: what are the national, in demographic terms, what were the national characteristics of Native, of indigenous peoples, particularly in this period? And what's your sense from the material you work with?
Yeah, it's a great question. The Southwestern Anishinaabe are really interesting as a faction, right? Because they are this people that migrate into the Chicago region in the 1740s and 50s, largely to get away from French influence, right? Mm-hmm. And then they kind of amalgamate. So by the time the US is treating with these groups in the early 19th century, the US is referring to them as the United Bands of Ottawas, Potawatomis, and Ojibways, which are the three primary Anishinaabe groups, right? The three fires, as they're called. So the US can't make sense of the ethnic identity of these people. And even Sigenauk, right, is kind of interethnic. He's married to a Potawatomi woman. He seems to be an Odawa himself, originally from the Mackinac area. And so it is this kind of amalgamated migratory group of Anishinaabe that move in and kind of become the main players in northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin during this point. So they are a dynamic, changing people in that sense, for sure.
Good. Okay. Thanks a lot, John. And much as I'd like to say more about this, I'm going to push on. So, John, excuse me, Ned and Brynne, I would try to, in a general sense, to lump your papers together. This is a little bit crude and overgeneralized, but in a certain sense, it seems to me both of your papers address underlying problems of federalism, a topic I've worked on for the last half century or so. And whether we use the terms of sovereignty, autonomy, the coordination of institutions, or representation, or just notions of local governance and how you relate to either state or federal authorities. These are all, to use the American term as opposed to more British terms, these are all aspects of how complex federal systems operate. So it seemed to me that was one, perhaps somewhat facile, but at least, potentially useful way to think about how your two papers relate one to each other. But now I have more particular questions, and Brynne, we'll deal with you first, and then Ned, if you don't mind, I'll turn to you later. So Brynne, since you did just have a big event in your graduate life yesterday, I wanted to ask you a famous question that my mentor, Bud Balin, would pose to graduate students. It was the most daunting question he could ask. You present your ideas and Bud would give a kind of quick summary of what you'd said, and then he'd say, "So what?" Which is really forced to ask you, what is the significance of what you're doing? So if I think about your project, it's be interesting to see what kinds of particular issues, arise in every community and how things are coordinated. But, the bigger story you're dealing with is really the story of civil military relations and, in a sense, the principle of civilian supremacy, which is or should be a core principle of American constitutionalism. It's much in the news hayom today for a variety of reasons. So this is, it may be a bit of a daunting question when you're still waiting to start writing, I assume, most of your chapters, but you have to be thinking about it, I hope. So how would you respond to that question?
Yes, well, I'm certainly trying to think about it. Thank you for your congratulations also on finishing my exams. I think that it matters in a couple of different ways. I think politically it's very important. So I recently read Barbara Clark Smith's The Freedoms We Lost, and that caused me to think very differently about my research, because I was wondering, why does this matter? I'm tracing just how intimately involved what seems to be a large swath of the American population was in the management of prisoners of war, and they're clearly acting, according to democratic traditions which are already instilled in their colonial governments, and they're trying to exercise these during the American Revolution, and they're meeting resistance from Continental Army officials. So I think that sort of in the same, she argues that there's this transition during the American Revolution from ordinary citizens having more of a role in policing and having more of a role in the enforcement of the law at the local level. I think that this is a similar story to the one that I'm trying to tell, where you have ordinary people trying to assert their authority to police on the local level, and that's being challenged by this first instance of common defense in the colonies. So I think that's one reason why it matters, is that this is an early moment where we see the challenging of crowd authority and maybe a move away from that, not necessarily with the Articles of Confederation, but later with the Constitution, it's codified that the crowds are not going to be enforcing the law anymore, at least not to the same extent that they were in the colonial period or during the American Revolution. And then I think the second reason is what you allude to, which is, civilian military relations. This is a question which is constantly being debated among Continental Army officials, but also within the Congress, about what allowances the Continental Army should have and what it shouldn't. And I think that this is an early example of Americans themselves, civilians, wanting to be involved in the Continental Army, perhaps to the same extent or with the same level of authority with which they interacted with their local militias. And again, it's not the same thing all of a sudden. The soldiers that are being stationed among them to watch these prisoners are not from town, they're from everywhere. And this creates a tension where there's not that same level of give and take that you might have in a militia type situation. And we see tensions emerging out of that. And I think that's important when thinking about the broader history of common defense in early America and how it was sort of a shock to early Americans who are more accustomed to militia systems or knowing the soldiers who are stationed among them. So I think it's important both from a civil military perspective, but also from the perspective of, crowd action and actually being involved democratically in the management of military matters on a local level.
Yeah, that's a really interesting response, and I mean, it gives me a lot to think about. I mean, the first thought that popped in my head is, going back in the day when I was starting out a long time ago. I mean, I was much influenced by John Shai's famous essay, the military conflict and series of Revolutionary War, and his discussion of the role of the militia as, in effect, as a kind of residual force that ensured in most communities Whig or Patriot supremacy. So independently of how well they function on the battlefield. But if I understood your answer correctly, the militia per se the American militia is not so important in the immediate particular context in which you're examining, in terms of, maybe because the prisoners are more of a nuisance than a threat. So I mean, something the problem you have to deal with, but not an overt threat to maintenance of order. Is that a fair way to put it, or I'm just gonna?
Well, yeah, so militia are definitely involved in the management of prisoners of war. Continental Army can't spare many men, so it's very often that militias are hired to be the guards. So they're definitely involved in the process. They're certainly important to the management of prisoners of war. But in terms of the way that locals in these towns interact with armed men, they're interacting with the militia system in a different way that they're interacting with the Continental Army. There's more of a clash of authority when the Continental Army comes to town than there is when you just have your local militiamen that are participating in this process as well. And that's sort of the tension that I see emerging between ordinary American civilians and the Continental Army is one that I like to hold up against the militia example to show that this is sort of where the rubber meets the road when it comes to common defense. All of a sudden, these are not locals. These are guys from all over the colonies. They've got an authority of their own, which is infringing on that of local governments, state governments, and it's gonna lead to some fireworks for sure.
Great answer. Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay, Ned, my my demographic counterpart on this panel. I have a more general question, which I think takes off from the thrust of your paper. As I read your account of the Scottish situation, which I thought for my own purposes is something I need to look at more closely than I have in the past. I mean, how much particularly the framers of the Constitution thought about the Scottish precedent from 70, 80 years earlier. I mean, certainly James Wilson, I'm sure, was deeply knowledgeable about it. I'm not sure about his amigos.
Witherspoon, of course.
I'm sorry?
Witherspoon, of course.
Witherspoon, of course, yeah.
They rely on him actually to give an account of what incorporated.
Okay, good. But but even so, I mean, the question I want to put to you moves in a somewhat different direction. So as I read your overall 18th century account on the Scottish side, there seems to be a kind of a richness, a density. I was going to say even a kind of a polymorphous. I won't say perverse, but a kind of polymorphous diversity of points of contact, of means of political leaders on either side of the Tweed, influencing one another and kind of interacting with one another and shaping policy and getting it moved in different directions. When I look at British policy towards the North American colonists from 1765 on, I mean, certainly not in 1778. Well, of course, we have Johnstone involved in the Carlisle Commission. It seems to me there's a kind of obtuseness on the part of British imperial authority. That there's a kind of, I won't say institutional rigidity, but a kind of, you rely on the governors, but all, other opportunities to pursue, it seems to be the kind of diverse forms of mediating and, working things out and kind of thinking creatively between the two countries don't seem to me to arise. So that, for example, when Franklin has his concluding discussions, before he sails back, to the colonies in early 1775, that seems to be almost an exception that proves the rule, that there should have been more. There should, why there's a failure to kind of interact outside the kind of the rigid structure of imperial authority strikes me as kind of a puzzle. I mean, it seems to me the British are basically making mistakes all the way down the road. I guess I am a patriot historian in this context, but I wonder if is that a fair concern of mine to raise? I mean, it seems to me your paper illustrates it in some ways. I'm just trying to take off from it.
Well, I think so. I mean, I think there are several things involved, but one of them, I mean, I think the 1707 Union was the easy one in the sense that it was not, England was incorporating with not a very big country. And it was one they didn't really care a whole lot about. They wanted to settle the succession. They wanted to pacify the border. And beyond that, they didn't really care, and they didn't expect to get much out of it. So they more or less maintained a laissez-faire situation, whereas the American situation became more complicated. It became more complicated in terms of, certainly in terms of the war itself, but then once that was over, in terms of the kinds of things that Britain expected to be able to get and rather easily get out of a colonial relationship, that they didn't have to make, they didn't want to make the kinds of accommodations that they had made that the metropolis had made with Scotland and that England had made with Scotland, which sort of assumed they didn't really need very much. And so they could, the easiest thing was to let those people govern themselves.
Yeah. But then given the greater stakes of the American, I guess, since I'm kind of implying, or at least wondering about, given the greater stakes in the loss of North America, why the British system wasn't more, in a sense, creative or adaptive in terms of trying to, it's often said that, King George, not that it ever would have happened, but King George III got on a ship and come to North America in 1774 and done a royal tour like George Washington in 1789, 1790. They would, probably would have solved the whole problem, just by the force of personality. So I just always been struck by the kind of the lack of creative thinking on the British part, even when their strategy keeps breaking down after 1774. They double down on their mistakes as opposed to thinking the situation.
There are a lot of suggestions of things, of ways to deal with it, but none of them really get a lot of traction. There are individual suggestions. There's lots of different ways they think about using an idea of representation or even incorporation, but you don't get a whole lot of people on the same side in that. You get sort of individual discussions here and there. And I think there's a kind of laziness about how to deal with it at the higher levels.
Yeah. Okay, so good. We have about 10 or so minutes left for our conversation. I think there is some suggestion that at the very end, maybe all of us or each of you should kind of look ahead to 2026 and imagine what might happen then. In between, so I have a handful of questions, and I have to kind of review them pretty quickly. But the first one, I think, Brynne would go to you. At least one that came up earlier. It had to do with are there gender specific aspects to the story of dealing with prisoners?
Yeah,
that don't appear in your paper, but that you think at least like to mention and discuss?
absolutely. Yes, this is certainly an angle which I hope to be able to dig into further. But women in particular do play a role in almost every element of this. So for one, prisoners sometimes had their families with them. And so that's one element of this which I'd like to explore further as I continue to work towards the dissertation prospectus. I think that they are very seldom in the record. And I'm not sure why. It's very interesting because I've read several records about prisoners of war, and they hardly ever mention the wives that often did come with prisoners. But that's one area where we do see women showing up in the history of prisoner of war management. Another one is women in these towns would often serve as either nurses, or they would help to house prisoners, particularly officers, by opening up their taverns or extra rooms that they had in their home for rent. So women show up both as sort of prisoner proxies themselves by coming with the prisoners, and then women also show up in the care and keeping of prisoners by opening both their private and their public homes to their hosting, and also by providing nursing services. And by doing both of those things, they're putting themselves at a risk. So I've read in the resources I came across an example of a husband who petitions the Connecticut state government and says, hey, you hired my wife to take care of these prisoners in Hartford, and now she's gotten very sick, and I need you to pay me back, right? So that's just one example of how women were actually putting themselves at a great risk by interacting with prisoners. And then by opening their homes and their public buildings that they owned as well to prisoners, they could open themselves up to the privations of prisoners. And frequently, actually, especially with officers, you'll have drunken escapades through the towns in which they're being hosted, just looking for people to harass. And often that is women whose husbands may not be there necessarily, or who may be running a tavern independently on their own. Frequently, they are submitting complaints to their local and state governments that they have been subject to the privations of imprisoned officers, which is an interesting pattern that I've noticed in the records that I'd like to continue exploring.
And Brynne, actually, if my male colleagues don't mind, I want to put one more question to Brynne here. Another question came up. It may have disappeared, but it still seems to be a good one. Suppose you do some differentiation between the British and the Hessians. Is that a dimension of your story as well? And are there any, as far as you know, as yet, are there any important things to keep in mind there?
Yeah, I think it definitely might be an important element to think about moving forward. And I've read the book that the questioner asked, which is Daniel Krebs's Generous and Merciful Enemy. Yes, wonderful book. If you haven't read it yet, run, don't walk. It's a great book. But he really raises some interesting insights about prisoner of war management in that book. One of them that I find most intriguing is that George Washington had a sort of, to call it in a nice way, a harebrained scheme that if the Hessians were placed among German Americans in areas with high concentrations of German Americans, that maybe they would, because they're mercenaries, they're paid, so we can maybe win them over to the British side or to the American side. And it's interesting because the Congress doesn't want any prisoners enlisting in the Continental Army. This is something that they say in that resolution that I showed in my presentation, but it happens sometimes. There's the distinction though, like British people, no, they can't enlist, but Hessians maybe, because they're paid. And Washington realizes quite epically that that is not the case at all. There's actually an animosity among German Americans towards Hessians. Daniel Miller talks about this, or Ken Miller talks about this as well in his book about Lancaster during the American Revolution and how Lancaster hosted prisoners of war. So there's definitely some contrasting ideas about how to take care of Hessians, and not everything that George Washington thinks is going to happen ends up happening with their care and management. But I have seen sort of a difference in the way that civilians are responding to Hessians versus British people, British prisoners. With the Hessians, there's almost more of they have a reputation of being fighting men, and that causes a great deal of fear among ordinary citizens who are hosting them. With the British, it's a little bit more, we're going to wait and see. And for the most part, the British prove themselves to be quite nuisant in their behaviors. So I will definitely keep that in mind moving forward and see how it plays into this broader story of local and state level governance of these imprisoned men.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes to go, and I think at this point, John and Ed, since you are the somewhat more senior scholars, one more senior than the other here, so let's have the two of you look ahead at 2026 and ask the question in your kind of ideal notion of how scholarship ought to, and interpretation for its own sake, ought to evolve between now and then in terms of how we think both critically and constructively about the revolution. So, John, I'll go to you first. Based on your work, what is it you'd like to see really evolve out of the kinds of concerns you're dealing with?
Good question. And I saw a few of these varieties pop up in the Q&A as well. So, I think for 2026, moving beyond just the 13 colonies is obviously an important facet to this, and moving beyond just our quintessential American patriots as the key players here. So bringing in the role of Spain, bringing in obviously the French alliance, super important always. And I think we know that, but highlighting kind of the global and multinational dimensions of the American Revolution is key. But then also, even on American soil, expanding the playing field beyond Boston and Yorktown to places like St. Joseph and St. Louis, or the Florida campaigns, the Mississippi River Valley, all of these different places where the conflict not only touches but dynamically changes the kind of the political landscape. So I think that would be a good goal towards 2026, and it certainly would resonate for hopefully an American audience in 2026 that way, right? Where we can get beyond just New England or just kind of the old the old historiography that some people might not be as excited to kind of jump in on. So that would be my.
I have to say, as a Chicago native, this is all news to me, and so that probably represents. And in 8th grade, I had to learn Illinois history. I mean, I know we have 102 counties still, which of course Cook is the most important. To work with, given this moment in our culture, I mean, I suppose do you think, which is becoming from week to week an ever more dangerous moment in local history. I mean, I suppose one might generalize this to say that maybe having a more continental story told ab initio from the beginning, as opposed to just making it a East Coast red brick, Williamsburg to Boston State House story, and throwing Charleston now and then to satisfy Woody would be helpful. Ned?
That's what I would say.
Ned,
I would think before I looked at 2026, I would think more about 2021 through 2024, and in terms of current circumstances, which bring up so much about the question of the American system, the American Constitution. Is America a democratic country, and what are all those things? But I think those things are very much going to be on the playing field and going to be subjects to talk about in the next few years, both in academia and beyond. And in some ways might bring that together a little bit. But it seems to me to go from there, we've got to think about questions about not only this particular system, it's a federal system, all right, it's a democratic system in a certain way, but what's it like, and what was going on elsewhere, and how similar and how different, what are really the distinctive things? I mean, in the popular culture, even in educated popular culture, so much of that is taken for granted about what is distinctive about the United States. And if you look at it closely, there are a lot, they were certainly integrated with the rest of the world, not the whole rest of the world, but many parts of the rest of the world, in ways that bring up interesting comparisons and maybe suggest things that even might have affected what American founders and other people at the time were thinking about, that we haven't really considered thus far.
I'll make one concluding remark here, then I guess we'll say that's a wrap. Just wrote a long review of a great book in 17th century English history, William Bowman's book, The Rise of Majority Rule in Early Modern Britain and Its Empire. Stuff on the empire, it's okay. It's really kind of an afterthought to the larger book, but it raises this really interesting question about the 17th century House of Commons. And how was it that decision-making by majority rule replaced consensual norms? And the idea that if you couldn't reach a consensus, you should avoid deciding the question, not lapse into a majority rule, but do that. And it's really made me think, I've gone back, I've been rereading Jack Poll's Political Representation in England and the Origins of the American Republic. Poll was my very first reviewer in 1979. Ned, the year I guess you were finishing your PhD, but the year my first book came out. And it's made me realize we don't have an adequate story about the nature of majority rule fully theorized. And now, we're living in this moment in history where now, of course, because of because of gerrymandering, because of the filibuster rule, which I've written in other places, I think is actually, in a sense, unconstitutional, and so on. We don't fully understand, given the complexities of the Constitution and its use of supermajoritarian principles, we don't fully comprehend what majority rule actually means in an American context. We take it so much for granted, the way actually John Locke did. I mean, Bullman makes this point, and Madison did. This point I made, various places, particularly in relationship to the religious, the memorial remonstrance against religious assessments. So that's something, that's an issue that we have not approached as comprehensively or as keenly as we ought to. And actually, Ned, reading your paper, I think, is, sends another illustration of this. So we've reached the witching hour, and actually have to go off and see my two grandsons for the last time, and before I head up to Philadelphia tomorrow, and then back to the coast. So I'm going to call this a wrap. I think these were three wonderful papers. I think, though they were very different in their orientation, they reinforced one another. complimented one another in interesting ways. And my sense is I think our conversation, notwithstanding my 2-minute lapse there, went pretty well. Kyle, do you have something concluding to say, or?
Just a thanks to all of our panelists and to you, Jack, for a great job moderating. Thanks, everyone.